ya. Another great day to have you here with Family Stories and Conversation. I'm Miss Piper from the Ellensburg Public Library. Today I will be reading The Watcher. Jane Goodall's Life with the Chimps. This book is by Jeanette Winter. Have you heard of Jane Goodall? This is a biography. It is a real story about a real person. I skipped who the publisher was. Who was that? Schwartz and Wade Books. Jane, where are you? Jane, can you hear me? Everyone had been searching for hours and hours looking for little Valerie Jane Goodall. Then from the hen house, Jane came running to her mother shouting, "I know how an egg comes out!" At 5 years old, Jane was already a watcher. Jane watched all the animals in her world, big and small. Earthworms, insects, birds, cats, dogs, and horses. Jane quietly watched an English robin at her window for days and weeks. She saw him come closer and closer, then into her room to eat some crumbs off her bed. When spring came, the robin even built a nest in Jane's bookcase. Perched high in her favorite beech tree, Jane read about Dr. Dolittle talking to the animals and Tarzan living with the apes in Africa. She wanted to go to Africa too and talk to the animals and live with the apes. When Jane's school days were over, she worked and saved to buy a ticket to Kenya. She hid her earnings under the parlor rug for safekeeping. Crossing the ocean, Jane stayed on deck and watched the waves even when the cold wind blew. She saw all the different blues and greens of the sea and fish that glowed through the dark water. As Jane stepped onto dry land, she closed her eyes in joy. Jane looked for work with animals. A famous scientist, Louis Leakey, was looking for someone to watch and study chimpanzees to help us understand the animal most like us. Would Jane be interested? Yes, she would. Jane traveled to the place in Tanzania where the chimps lived, Gombe. I want to learn things that no one else knew, uncover secrets, she wrote. She set up camp far from any human dwelling. That first night, Jane lay awake listening to new sounds, the croak of a frog, the hum of crickets, the laugh of a hyena, the hoot of an owl, and looking up at the stars, she knew she was home with a capital H. At dawn, Jane walked into the forest. Up high, she found a peak to watch from. Every day she climbed to the peak to look for chimps. But though she could hear their pant-hoot calls to one another, she didn't see them. Jane walked down into the forest, hoping a chimp would appear. Still, the cautious chimp stayed hidden. Secretly, they watched Jane. When will I see a chimp? She wondered. Then Jane fell ill with malaria. Lying in her tent, burning with fever, she almost lost hope. But when her fever left her body, she tried again to get close to the chimps. More weeks and months passed till one day the chimps let Jane see them. She stayed in the background, never hid, acted uninterested, and quietly watched. Now Jane watched every day, all day, even huddled in the rain. She saw the chimps accept the rain, not look for shelter as we do. And she kept notes about it all. You have to be patient if you want to learn about animals, she wrote. Some nights, Jane even slept on the peak to be near the tree where the chimps were sleeping. She woke at dawn and saw them slowly rise from their nests, sit for a spell, then go off to find food. Jane named the chimps. To her, each one was different, just like us. A gray-bearded chimp was the first to approach Jane. She named him David Graybeard. David Graybeard has, yes, he has taken bananas from my hand. So gently, no snatching, she wrote. David Graybeard let Jane come close. She watched him shape a stick into a tool to dig for termites. Before this, nobody knew that animals made tools. She watched David Gray eat meat. Before this, everybody thought chimps ate only plants. I think I said David Gray, and it should be David Graybeard. And because David Graybeard trusted Jane, now the other chimps let Jane come close too. Chimps all around me, what a day! Chimps near, chimps far, old men, young men, ladies, children, babies, teenagers, the lot, she wrote. Jane watched the chimps when they were happy. She saw them hold hands and hug and kiss and laugh just like us. Jane watched the chimps when they were angry or scared and their hair stood on end. She saw them swagger and throw tantrums and kept out of their way. Jane watched the chimps at the Cacoby Fall waterfall, leaping and swinging in awe and wonder at the tumbling water. At night, after supper of beans and tomatoes and onions, Jane listened to Mozart and Bach as she wrote up her notes from the day. Years of notes were piled high everywhere. Jane needed help, and so assistants came to watch and write. One day, Jane sadly left Gombe. All across Africa, forests were being cut down, and the chimps were losing their homes. Poachers were shooting grown chimps and kidnapping their babies to sell to laboratories, to the circus, and as pets. Jane's beloved chimpanzees were in danger of becoming extinct. They needed Jane to speak for them. Jane hated to leave her friends, but she knew she must. She traveled to big cities and small towns the world over, month after month, year after year, asking for help to save the chimps and the forests. Jane returned to the forests of Gombe whenever she could. She climbed up to the peak calling, "Hello!" to the streams and hills and trees, David Graybeard at her side. Jane watched and listened again to the pant-hoot calls of her friends. And when she went back to civilization to speak out for the chimps, Jane carried with her the peace of the forest. The forest in Gombe, where she talked to the animals like Dr. Dolittle, and walked unafraid like Tarzan, and watched and wrote, and opened a window for us to the world of the chimpanzees. Here is a note about this story. You can check this book out from the Ellensburg Public Library and learn more about this note. You may read it and learn about Jane Goodall and maybe a little bit about the author too. The end of The Watcher. Jane Goodall's Life with the Chimps by Jeanette Winter. All right, you good ones. I have some questions for you, as you knew I might, right? Am I right? Question number 1. There is something that I noticed about the pictures in this story, and I feel like we might have talked about this before, and that is at the beginning of the story, the pictures, did you notice they're in like small little squares? One on each page, small square, small square, small square, small square. And then all of a sudden, the pictures started going outside of the square, and then the picture started taking up the whole page and not being in the square at all. And I wondered if you thought it might have followed along with the story and what was happening in the story. Did you notice that? What did you think was happening when the pictures was going from being inside a small little square to taking up the whole page? Question number 2. The Watcher. Jane the Watcher. And there were several points along the way where they talked about her watching and watching patiently. You can learn a lot from watching. Have you ever just stopped and watched for a while? Even sometimes when you don't know that you're doing it, you're watching. It's a lot of how we learn. Maybe you could even do that now, and maybe it's less of a question and more of a suggestion. Maybe you could go out and sit down and just watch and see what you learn. Question number 3. What animal would you study? All right. Have a happy day, have a happy week, and I will see you next time. See ya.